They called me their greatest disappointment. Not whispered behind my back, but screamed across the mahogany dining table during Sunday dinner, in front of my stepfather's colleagues, the housekeeper, even the neighbors who'd come over for my mother's famous rosemary lamb. I'm Victoria Hartwell. I'm 29. And the last words my mother ever spoke to me were, "You're an embarrassment to the Hartwell name. Don't you dare show your face at another family function ever again." I can still see the crystal chandelier shaking from the force of her voice that night in Windermere Heights, our family's estate overlooking Lake Thornfield. The same dining room where I'd sat as a little girl, sketching business plans in the margins of my homework while listening to Dad, my real father, talk about his import business before the cancer took him when I was 12. But this wasn't about a failed test or a broken vase. This was about my pathetic little computer project, as Mother called it, my startup, the one I'd been secretly building in the converted wine cellar of our estate for 3 years, surviving on ramen noodles and sheer determination while the rest of Windermere Heights slept in their silk sheets above me. The trigger that night? I'd missed my cousin Anastasia's engagement party at the country club. Not because I didn't care about family. I'd actually been coding for 46 straight hours, trying to fix a critical bug that could make or break our first major client presentation. But try explaining that to Eleanor Hartwell, Windermere Heights' self-appointed social queen, whose greatest achievement was organizing charity galas where rich women competed over who could wear the most expensive dress while writing tax-deductible checks. "Victoria has always been different," she told the Ashford family that night, her voice dripping with that particular brand of disappointment that only comes from years of practice. While her sister Penelope is studying international law at Westbridge University, Victoria wastes her Stanford education playing with computers in our basement like some common technical support person. The Ashfords nodded sympathetically. Richard Ashford owned half the commercial real estate in Windermere Heights. His wife, Priscilla, ran the most exclusive boutique on Maple Ridge Boulevard. Their son had just gotten engaged to my sister Penelope, and they were clearly wondering what kind of family they were marrying into. "We've tried everything," Mother continued, cutting her lamb with surgical precision. "Sent her to the finest schools, introduced her to the right people, even set up interviews at respectable firms. But she insists on this foolishness, building something called an app that no one understands or wants." My stepfather, Dr. Harrison Blackthorne, yes, the Harrison Blackthorne who owned 3 private medical practices and sat on the board of Windermere General Hospital, cleared his throat. "Eleanor, perhaps we shouldn't discuss this in front of our guests." But Mother was just getting started. She'd been holding this in for months, maybe years. Every passive-aggressive comment about my phase, every eye roll when I tried to explain what I was building, every time she introduced me as our daughter who's still figuring things out, had been leading to this moment. "Do you know what she told me last week?" Mother's voice rose, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling around her wine glass. She said she was going to change the world with technology. Change the world? As if the world needs changing by someone who can't even remember to attend family obligations. I sat there in my one good dress, the navy blue one I'd bought 3 years ago and wore to every family function because I couldn't afford anything new, watching my mother perform my public execution for an audience of Windermere Heights elite. The same people who'd known me since I was 5, who'd watched me win the state science fair 3 years running, who'd seen me graduate summa cum laude from Stanford with degrees in computer science and business. But those achievements didn't matter in this room. What mattered was that I wasn't Penelope, who looked perfect in every family photo, who dated the right men, who was studying the right subjects at the right university. What mattered was that I'd chosen passion over prestige, innovation over inheritance. "The Hartwell name means something in this town," Mother continued, her voice now carrying across the entire first floor of our estate. 4 generations of respected business owners, community leaders, philanthropists. And then there's Victoria, hiding in the basement, building something that will never amount to anything. She paused, took a long sip of her wine, and delivered the killing blow. "Sometimes I wonder if she's even my daughter. No child of mine would be satisfied with such mediocrity. The room fell silent, except for the soft clink of silverware against china. Mrs. Ashford cleared her throat uncomfortably. The housekeeper, Maria, pretended to be busy refilling water glasses, but I caught her sympathetic glance. And then came the moment that changed everything. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and did something I'd never done before in 29 years of living in Eleanor Hartwell's shadow. I spoke back. "You're right, Mother. I am different, and maybe this mediocrity you're so ashamed of will surprise you someday." Her face turned the color of her expensive burgundy wine. "How dare you speak to me that way in front of our guests? Get out of this house. Get out right now. You're an embarrassment to the Hartwell name. Don't you dare show your face at another family function ever again." I walked out of that dining room, past the family portraits in the hallway, past the marble staircase where I'd slid down the banister as a child, past the library where Dad used to read me stories about entrepreneurs who changed the world. I packed a single suitcase and moved into a studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House in downtown Millbrook, the part of town where the Hartwells never ventured. And I promised myself that night, as sirens wailed in the distance and neon signs flickered through my thin curtains, that I would prove her wrong. What Mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 months later, my pathetic little computer project would land our first million-dollar client. 6 months after that, we'd be featured in Forbes. And exactly 18 months from that humiliating dinner, CNN would name me their youngest CEO of the year. But that night in Windermere Heights, as I drove away from the only home I'd ever known, I was just Victoria Hartwell, the family disappointment who dared to dream bigger than her mother's expectations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I didn't start building my company out of rebellion or spite. I started it because of Mrs. Abernathy. 3 years before that disastrous dinner, I was working my dream job at Pinnacle Solutions, one of Westbridge City's most prestigious consulting firms. Corner office on the 34th floor, 6-figure salary, company car, everything Mother had wanted for me. I was the poster child for Hartwell family success, attending charity galas and designer dresses, and networking with the city's elite, just like I'd been raised to do. But then, Mrs. Abernathy called our helpline. She was 73, living alone in Riverside Gardens, a modest neighborhood about an hour from downtown. Her grandson had set up online banking for her before he left for college, but something had gone wrong. Her account showed transactions she'd never made, withdrawals that didn't make sense. She was losing money she couldn't afford to lose, money meant for her medications, her groceries, her tiny apartment rent. "Please," she whispered into the phone that Tuesday morning, "I don't understand these computers. My grandson tried to help me over the phone, but I just make it worse. The bank says everything looks normal on their end, but I know something's wrong. I've been tracking every penny for 50 years. I know when money goes missing." Standard protocol at Pinnacle was clear. Refer elderly clients with computer problems to basic tech support, charge them $300 for a consultation, and move on to bigger clients. Mrs. Abernathy's case wasn't profitable enough to warrant senior consultant attention. But something in her voice reminded me of Dad, the way he used to worry about his employees at the import business, staying up late making sure everyone's paychecks cleared properly. "Victoria," he'd told me when I was 8, "business isn't just about making money. It's about taking care of people who trust you with their problems." So I drove to Riverside Gardens that evening. Mrs. Abernathy's apartment was smaller than my walk-in closet at the estate, but immaculate. She served me tea in delicate china cups, probably her wedding set, and showed me her handwritten ledgers. Every transaction documented in careful cursive script going back decades. She was right. Someone had been siphoning small amounts from her account using a sophisticated algorithm that disguised the thefts as legitimate bank fees. $5 here, $8 there, amounts small enough to escape notice, but devastating for someone living on a fixed income. It took me 6 hours to trace the digital trail and build a case. The bank initially dismissed my findings until I presented them with evidence of similar thefts across 47 other elderly accounts. Mrs. Abernathy got her money back, plus damages. 46 other seniors got justice too. But that night, sitting in her tiny kitchen as she cried with relief, I realized something that would change everything. I wish there was someone who specialized in helping people like me, she said, refilling my teacup with shaking hands. Someone who understands that when you're old and your children live far away, these computer things feel impossible. We're not stupid, dear. We're just scared. Mrs. Abernathy was right. The technology industry had created incredible tools for young, tech-savvy users, but had largely abandoned an entire generation. Seniors were easy targets for digital predators precisely because existing solutions were too complex, too impersonal, too intimidating. That's when the idea hit me. What if there was a platform specifically designed for seniors? Simple interfaces, human customer support, built-in security features that protected vulnerable users from scams and fraud. Not dumbed-down technology, smart technology that adapted to their needs. I spent the next 3 months researching, interviewing dozens of seniors across Westbridge County. I discovered that digital literacy wasn't the real problem. Trust was. Seniors didn't need simpler technology. They needed technology they could trust, built by people who actually cared about their safety and dignity. I pitched the concept to my bosses at Pinnacle Solutions. ElderShield Digital, I called it, a comprehensive platform that would combine banking security, simplified interfaces, and dedicated human support for users over 60. The response was swift and brutal. "Victoria, sweetheart," said my supervisor, Martin Carruthers III, leaning back in his leather chair, "seniors don't have disposable income for premium services. They clip coupons and complain about prices. There's no real money in that demographic. But the market research shows exactly what I just told you," he interrupted. "Poor people don't buy expensive solutions. Stick to what we do best, helping clients who can actually afford our fees." So I made a choice that would cost me everything I'd worked for. I quit Pinnacle Solutions, cashed out my 401k, and moved back to the family estate, not because I wanted to live under Mother's roof again, but because I needed every dollar I could save to build something that mattered. For 18 months, I converted our wine cellar into a development studio. While Mother hosted her garden parties upstairs, I was building algorithms downstairs. While Penelope brought home law school friends for dinner, I was conducting user interviews with seniors via video call. While Dr. Blackthorne talked about his latest medical conference, I was debugging code until sunrise. I used my entire inheritance from Dad, the money he'd left specifically for my future, to hire 2 brilliant developers from overseas who believed in the vision. We worked 16-hour days, surviving on coffee and determination, building something no one else thought was worth building. ElderShield Digital wasn't just an app, it was a complete ecosystem: secure banking with fraud detection, simplified video calling for families, medication reminders, emergency contact systems, and 24/7 human support from real people who were trained to be patient and kind. But Mother saw none of this. She saw her daughter wasting her education in the basement, turning down invitations to respectable social events, refusing to network with appropriate people. She saw someone who had abandoned the Hartwell path to success for what looked like an elaborate hobby. What she didn't see was that I'd found something more valuable than her approval, a purpose worth sacrificing everything for. The night she threw me out, ElderShield Digital had been live for exactly 2 weeks. We had 847 users across 3 states, including Mrs. Abernathy, who'd become our first beta tester and unofficial ambassador. As I packed my single suitcase and prepared to leave Windermere Heights forever, I thought about Dad's words. Business isn't just about making money, it's about taking care of people who trust you with their problems. I was about to find out if caring was enough to build an empire. Before I tell you what happened next, how a company born in a wine cellar became worth $847 million in less than 2 years, I need to ask you something. Have you ever believed in something so deeply that you were willing to lose everything for it? Have you ever had that moment where everyone you love tells you you're making the biggest mistake of your life, but something in your gut whispers that they're wrong? Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you chose your dreams over other people's expectations. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't just my story, it's proof that sometimes the people who know you best understand you least. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever been called crazy for chasing a vision that seemed impossible, because this story gets wild, and I promise you haven't heard anything like it before. You see, the night I moved into that studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House, I wasn't just leaving my family's estate. I was crossing into a world that the Hartwells of Windermere Heights never acknowledged existed. The world where people work 3 jobs to pay rent, where dreams are built with borrowed laptops and instant coffee, where failure isn't just embarrassing, it's devastating. My new neighborhood in downtown Millbrook was everything Mother had taught me to avoid. The building was a converted warehouse from the 1940s, with thin walls, unreliable heating, and a persistent smell of garlic and soy sauce that seeped up from the restaurant below. My studio apartment was exactly 342 square feet. I measured it twice because I couldn't believe it was smaller than our estate's coat closet. But here's what my family never understood about that choice. I wasn't running away from privilege, I was running toward authenticity. For the first time in my life, I woke up every morning with a purpose that had nothing to do with maintaining appearances or meeting someone else's expectations. My alarm went off at 5 a.m., not because I had to attend some charity breakfast or networking event, but because Mrs. Chen downstairs started prep work early, and her kitchen sounds had become my wake-up call. Mrs. Chen, it turned out, was exactly the kind of person ElderShield Digital was designed to help. 68 years old, she'd been running the noodle house with her husband for 32 years. Their son had set up a basic payment system for online orders, but Mrs. Chen was terrified of touching the computer. She'd been writing down phone orders by hand and having customers pay cash only, losing hundreds of potential customers who expected digital convenience. "You understand computers, yes?" she asked me one morning as I grabbed coffee before heading to the small office space I'd rented 3 blocks away. "My son says I'm too old to learn, but I see young people order food with their phones. I lose money every day. I don't understand this." That conversation sparked something powerful. Mrs. Chen became my first real-world test case for ElderShield Digital's small business module, a simplified interface that let older entrepreneurs manage digital payments, track inventory, and communicate with customers without needing a computer science degree. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Chen was processing online orders, tracking her best-selling dishes, and even sending thank you messages to regular customers. Her revenue increased by 340%. More importantly, her confidence transformed completely. She went from being intimidated by technology to mastering it, and she started telling every senior business owner in Millbrook about that smart girl upstairs who makes computers friendly. This is where the story gets interesting, and why I need you to understand something crucial. Success isn't always visible from the outside. Crucial success isn't always visible from the outside. While my family was telling their friends that I'd lost my way and was living in some slum, I was actually building something extraordinary. Every morning, I'd walk past the same homeless veteran outside the subway station, and every evening, I'd buy him dinner from Mrs. Chen's restaurant. His name was Frank, and he'd been a software engineer before PTSD and addiction derailed his life. Frank became my unofficial advisor and beta tester. He understood both technology and the feeling of being dismissed by society. "Miss Victoria," he told me one evening as we shared lo mein on the fire escape, "you're building something that gives people their dignity back. That's worth more than all the fancy offices in Westbridge City." He was right. ElderShield Digital wasn't just growing, it was changing lives. Mrs. Abernathy had connected with 7 other seniors in her building who were also being targeted by digital scams. Using our platform's community features, they'd formed a support network that caught 3 attempted frauds in the first month. A 72-year-old artist named Harold Finn started selling his paintings online for the first time in his life, earning enough to afford better art supplies. Maria Santos, a retired teacher, used our video calling features to start tutoring grandchildren across the country, creating both income and connection during the pandemic isolation. But here's what really mattered. Every single one of these success stories was happening while my family continued to see my life as a failure. Mother would call occasionally, not to check on my well-being, but to inform me about family events I was no longer invited to attend. "Penelope just got promoted to senior associate," she'd announce. "Dr. Blackthorne is being honored at the Medical Society Gala. Even your cousin Timothy bought a house in Westbridge Hills. Everyone is doing so well." The subtext was always clear. Everyone except you. But subscribers, here's what I want you to understand. Sometimes the people who love you most are the least equipped to see your potential. My family had spent so many years defining success in terms of social status, traditional careers, and public recognition that they literally couldn't recognize innovation when it was happening right in front of them. They saw me eating ramen noodles in a studio apartment and assumed I'd failed. They didn't see the spreadsheets showing month-over-month growth rates that venture capitalists would later call unprecedented. They saw me wearing the same 3 outfits in rotation and assumed I was struggling financially. They didn't see the bank account growing from strategic reinvestment of every dollar back into the platform. They saw me missing family functions and assumed I was avoiding responsibility. They didn't see the 18-hour workdays, the customer support calls at midnight, the coding sessions that stretched until sunrise because a senior citizen in Oregon was having trouble with their medication reminders. That's the thing about building something revolutionary. It often looks like chaos from the outside. Innovation rarely follows a neat, recognizable path that older generations can understand and approve of. So before I tell you about the phone call that changed everything, the one that came exactly 14 months after Mother threw me out of Windermere Heights, I want to know, have you ever been in that position? Have you ever had to choose between proving yourself to your family and proving yourself to the world? Because what happened next didn't just vindicate my choices, it redefined what success meant for an entire industry. And it started with a single email from someone I'd never heard of at a company that would change my life forever. Keep watching, because this is where the impossible becomes inevitable. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 6:43 a.m., just as I was debugging a critical security update for our payment processing system. The sender's name made my stomach drop. Victoria Hartwell. Mother never sent emails. She considered them impersonal and common. If she was writing instead of calling, something was seriously wrong. Victoria, the message began, with none of her usual formal greeting. Your grandmother Vivian has asked to see you. She's dying. The doctors say weeks, maybe days. Despite everything that's happened, she specifically requested your presence at Thornfield Manor. I suppose even dying people make poor decisions. Be here Sunday at 3 p.m. if you have any decency left. Don't embarrass us further with your current lifestyle choices. Grandmother Vivian, the matriarch of the Hartwell family, the woman who'd built our fortune from a small textile business into a regional empire. She was 91, sharp as a blade, and the only family member who'd ever asked me about my dreams instead of dismissing them. I hadn't seen her since the dinner disaster 18 months ago, but we'd exchanged letters, actual handwritten letters, every few weeks. I'd told her about ElderShield Digital, about the users we were helping, about the vision I was building. Her responses were always encouraging, always asking thoughtful questions about the technology and the business model. She never once suggested I was wasting my life. Sunday couldn't come fast enough. I borrowed Mrs. Chen's car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that wheezed up the winding road to Thornfield Manor, and tried to prepare myself for the first family gathering since my exile. The estate looked exactly the same. Perfectly manicured lawns, imported Italian fountains, the kind of old-money grandeur that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. I parked between Penelope's silver Mercedes and Dr. Blackthorn's Bentley, suddenly hyper-aware of my worn jeans and thrift store blouse. The housekeeper, Maria, the same one who'd witnessed my public humiliation, answered the door with a sympathetic smile. Miss Victoria, your grandmother is in the sunroom. She's been asking about you all morning. I walked through the familiar hallways, past oil paintings of long-dead Hartwells, past the library where grandmother had taught me to read financial reports when I was 8. The sunroom overlooked the rose garden, and there she sat in her antique wheelchair, still elegant despite the oxygen tank beside her chair. Victoria, darling, she said, her voice paper-thin but warm, come here and tell me about this revolution you're building. For 20 minutes, we talked about ElderShield Digital like it was the most natural thing in the world. She asked about user acquisition strategies, revenue models, competitive advantages. She understood business in a way that impressed me. After all, she'd been making deals when most women weren't allowed in boardrooms. Then the rest of the family arrived. Mother swept in first, wearing a black Chanel suit that probably cost more than my entire yearly rent. She air-kissed grandmother's cheek and completely ignored my presence, settling into the chair farthest from where I sat. Penelope followed, resplendent in designer everything, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light like a disco ball. Grandmother, she announced, I have wonderful news. The Ashford wedding planning is going perfectly. We've booked the cathedral for next spring, and the reception will be at the country club. 300 guests confirmed already. Dr. Blackthorn joined us, immediately checking grandmother's oxygen levels and discussing her medications with the nurse. Professional, caring, completely in his element as the respected family physician. And then came the moment that shattered any hope I'd had for reconciliation. "Well," Mother said, settling her purse in her lap, "now that we're all here, perhaps Victoria can explain what she's been doing with herself. I heard from Patricia Wyndham that she saw you working in some restaurant downtown. Is that true?" The way she said restaurant made it sound like I'd been caught robbing banks. "I live above a restaurant," I said carefully. "I don't work there." "Oh, that's so much better," Penelope chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "Living above a restaurant in Millbrook? Victoria, what happened to you? You had everything, the pinnacle job, the corner office, respect in the community, and you threw it all away for what? Some computer games?" "It's not computer games, Penelope. It's a technology platform that helps—" "That helps who?" Mother interrupted. "Who exactly is benefiting from your little hobby? Because from where I sit, the only person it's hurt is you. Look at yourself, Victoria. When was the last time you bought new clothes? When was the last time you attended a proper social function? You're 29 years old, and you're living like a college student." I felt the familiar fire rising in my chest, the same anger that had driven me to speak back that night 18 months ago. But Grandmother caught my eye and shook her head slightly. This wasn't the time or place. "The technology sector is very competitive," Dr. Blackthorne added, his tone measured and clinical. "Perhaps it's time to consider more traditional career paths. I could make some calls, get you interviews at respectable firms. You're still young enough to recover from this detour." Detour? As if my life's work was just a wrong turn on the highway to respectability. "Victoria doesn't need career advice," Grandmother said, quietly, but her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Support?" Mother's voice rose to that familiar pitch that meant an explosion was coming. "Vivian, with all due respect, we've been supporting her poor decisions for almost 2 years. We've watched her throw away every advantage we've given her. We've endured the embarrassment of explaining why our daughter lives in a slum instead of contributing to society like her sister. Penelope contributes to society by planning weddings and attending charity lunches," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. The room went silent except for the soft hiss of Grandmother's oxygen tank. Penelope's face flushed red. "I'm getting a law degree from Westbridge University. I'm marrying into one of the most respected families in the county. I'm building a life that matters." "A life that matters to whom?" I shot back. "To the society pages? To the country club membership committee?" "Girls, please," Dr. Blackthorne tried to intervene, but Mother was already standing. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Victoria, you come into this house that your family built, that provides the lifestyle you were raised in, and you show complete disrespect for everything we value. You mock your sister's accomplishments, you dismiss our concerns, and you expect us to pretend that your failure is actually success." She moved closer to my chair, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Do you want to know what people say about you? Do you want to know how it feels when Patricia Wyndham asks me why my daughter is living above a Chinese restaurant? When the Ashfords wonder what kind of family they're marrying into? When everyone who matters in this community sees the Hartwell name associated with whatever it is you're doing down there?" I stood up slowly, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of keeping my voice steady. "I don't care what Patricia Wyndham thinks, Mother. I don't care what the Ashfords think. I don't care what anyone in your precious community thinks about me." "Well, you should care," she snapped, "because reputation is everything. Success is about more than whatever fantasies you're chasing in that basement. Success is about respect, stability, contributing to something bigger than yourself." "I am contributing to something bigger than myself," I said. "I'm helping people who've been forgotten by everyone else. I'm building something that matters." Mother laughed, actually laughed, a sound so cold it made me shiver. "Building something that matters? Victoria, you're 29 years old, living in poverty, working on some project that no one understands or wants. That's not building something. That's destroying everything your father and I worked to give you. She straightened her jacket and looked around the room, appealing to the assembled family like a prosecutor addressing a jury. This is what I mean. This is why we can't enable this behavior anymore. Victoria has convinced herself that failure is actually noble, that poverty is actually principled. She's lost touch with reality, and as long as we keep pretending her choices are acceptable, she'll never come to her senses. The worst part wasn't her words, it was the way everyone else in the room nodded along. Even grandmother looked uncertain now, as if mother's certainty was somehow more convincing than her own instincts about my character. I looked around that sunroom, at the family I'd once thought would always have my back, and realized something that changed everything. They weren't just disappointed in me, they were genuinely convinced I had failed at life. And maybe, just maybe, they were about to find out how wrong they were. I stayed for 3 more hours that Sunday, and every minute was a masterclass in systematic humiliation designed to break whatever spirit I had left. It started with dinner. The formal dining room had been set for 5 people, but when we sat down, I realized they'd deliberately placed me at the children's table, a small side table that hadn't been used since Penelope and I were under 12. Mother announced this arrangement without explanation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Victoria will be more comfortable here, she told grandmother, gesturing toward the tiny table with its single place setting. She's not really part of the main conversation anyway. From my exile 3 feet away, I watched my family discuss Penelope's wedding plans, Dr. Blackthorn's latest medical conference achievements, and Mother's upcoming charity gala, all topics I was apparently too irrelevant to contribute to. When the housekeeper served dinner, I got the smallest portions, served last, as if I were an afterthought rather than a daughter. But the real cruelty wasn't in the seating arrangement. It was in how they talked about me as if I weren't there. I worry about her mental health, Mother confided to Dr. Blackthorn over the main course. This delusion that she's accomplished something meaningful, it's not normal, is it? Healthy people don't abandon stable careers for fantasies. Isolation can exacerbate delusional thinking, he replied, cutting his lamb with clinical precision. Living alone, away from family influence, working on projects that exist only in her imagination, it's textbook behavior for someone experiencing a break from reality. They were diagnosing me. Right there at the dinner table, 3 feet away, they were discussing my supposed mental illness as if I were a case study rather than a family member. What exactly does this company of hers even do? Penelope asked, making air quotes around the word company. Because from what I understand, she's basically running a customer service center for old people who can't figure out their phones. That's not, I started to say, but Mother held up her hand. Victoria, please, we're trying to have a civilized conversation about your situation. Interrupting won't help anyone understand the severity of your circumstances. The severity of my circumstances, as if I were a charity case they were discussing at one of their fundraising dinners. After the meal, things got worse. Mother announced that she'd taken the liberty of researching my living situation by driving through Millbrook the previous week. She'd photographed the building where I lived, the neighborhood streets, even the outside of Mrs. Chen's restaurant. I wanted to see for myself what Victoria considers acceptable, she explained, pulling out her phone to show the family. This is where our daughter, a Stanford graduate, remember, has chosen to live. She scrolled through photos like she was presenting evidence in a criminal trial. The faded brick exterior of my building, the narrow alley where residents parked their cars, the neon sign for Chen's Noodle House that flickered intermittently. Look at this, she said, zooming in on a photo of the front entrance. The door doesn't even lock properly. There's graffiti on the sidewall. This is the environment Victoria thinks is appropriate for a Hartwell. Grandmother studied the photos with obvious concern. Victoria, dear, surely you could find somewhere safer, more suitable. Before I could answer, Mother launched into what could only be described as a comprehensive attack on every aspect of my life choices. It's not just the living situation, Vivian. It's everything. Look at her clothes. The same outfit she wore to Christmas dinner last year. Look at her hair. When was the last time you visited a proper salon, Victoria? Your nails, your posture, your complete lack of social connections with appropriate people. She paused to let this inventory of her failures sink in. Patricia Wyndham's daughter saw Victoria at the grocery store last month, buying generic brands and counting coupons like some... She stopped herself, but we all knew what she'd been about to say. I live within my means, I said quietly. I invest everything back into the business. What business? Dr. Blackthorne asked, his tone suggesting genuine confusion. Victoria, I've asked colleagues in the technology sector about your project. No one has heard of it. There's no registered company with that name in the county records. As far as anyone can tell, this ElderShield Digital doesn't actually exist. The room went completely silent. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to pause between ticks. It exists, I said, but my voice sounded smaller than I'd intended. Where? Penelope demanded. Show us proof. Show us your business license, your tax filings, your employee records. Show us one piece of evidence that this isn't just an elaborate fantasy you've constructed to avoid admitting you've made terrible life choices. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I tried to navigate to our user dashboard, but the Wi-Fi at Thornfield Manor required a password, and nobody offered to share it. I tried to load our website using cellular data, but the connection was too weak in the estate's thick-walled sunroom. I can't get online here, I explained, but I have screenshots, user testimonials. Screenshots can be faked, Mother said dismissively. Victoria, this is exactly what we're talking about. You're so invested in this fiction that you're carrying around fabricated evidence to support it. The intervention, because that's what this had become, continued for another hour. They tag-teamed me with questions I couldn't adequately answer without an internet connection, documents I hadn't brought because I'd thought I was visiting a dying grandmother, not defending my entire existence. Dr. Blackthorne suggested I might benefit from professional counseling to address the underlying issues driving these escapist behaviors. Mother proposed a timeline for me to come to my senses, 30 days to wind down my project and accept help finding real employment. Penelope offered to let me be a bridesmaid in her wedding, assuming you can get yourself together enough to be appropriate in photos. Even that was framed as charity, as if being included in her wedding party would be motivation enough to abandon everything I'd built. But the lowest point came when Mother pulled out a folder she'd prepared in advance. I've taken the liberty of researching some options for you, she said, spreading papers across the coffee table. Entry-level positions at respectable firms, all willing to overlook this gap in your employment history. Administrative assistant at Blackthorne Medical Group, receptionist at the Wyndham Insurance Agency, customer service representative at First National Bank. She slid the papers toward me like she was offering salvation. These are real jobs, Victoria, with steady paychecks, benefits, normal coworkers. You could move back home while you save money for a proper apartment. We could help you rebuild your life the right way. The right way, as if everything I'd accomplished in the past 2 years had been fundamentally wrong. I don't want to be a receptionist, I said. Want? Mother's voice sharpened. Victoria, you're 29 years old, living in poverty with no savings, no prospects, and no relationship with anyone who matters. This isn't about what you want anymore. This is about damage control. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the tone she'd used when I was a child, being scolded for tracking mud through the house. You have exactly one chance to salvage this situation before it becomes completely irreversible, before you become one of those people, the ones we see at charity events who need help instead of providing it, the ones who started with every advantage and threw it all away for pride. The conversation ended when grandmother announced she was tired and needed rest. As I prepared to leave, each family member offered their version of goodbye. Dr. Blackthorne shook my hand and pressed his business card into my palm. Call me when you're ready to be realistic about your future, he said. Penelope hugged me awkwardly and whispered, It's not too late to fix this, Victoria, but you have to want to be helped. Mother didn't touch me at all. She simply stood by the door and delivered her final assessment. I love you enough to tell you the truth, Victoria. This fantasy you're living, it's destroying you. And watching you destroy yourself is destroying this family. Come home when you're ready to be honest about what your life has become. I drove back to Millbrook in Mrs. Chen's wheezing Honda, tears blurring my vision as I replayed every moment of systematic degradation I'd just endured. They hadn't just criticized my choices,
They deconstructed my entire sense of self, piece by piece, until I almost believed them. Almost. Because when I got back to my studio apartment, there was an email waiting that would change everything. An email from someone named David Rockman at Atlantic Ventures, one of the most prestigious investment firms on the East Coast. Ms. Hartwell, it began, we've been tracking ElderShield Digital's growth metrics, and we'd like to discuss a potential partnership. Are you available for a call tomorrow to discuss a Series A funding round? I stared at that email for 20 minutes, reading it over and over again, making sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I called Mrs. Chen upstairs and asked if I could borrow her kitchen to make the strongest coffee she'd ever seen. Because tomorrow, everything was about to change. The call with David Rockman at Atlantic Ventures was scheduled for 10 a.m. Tuesday morning, but at 8:47 a.m., I discovered something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my family's motives. I'd been preparing for the investor call by reviewing our financial projections when I noticed something odd in our business banking account. There were several small transactions I didn't recognize, amounts like $247, $163, $294, all labeled as service fees or processing charges. At first, I assumed they were legitimate bank fees, maybe related to our rapid growth in transaction volume. But when I called the bank to verify, the customer service representative couldn't find any record of these charges in their system. Ma'am, according to our records, your account shouldn't have any service fees beyond the standard monthly maintenance charge, said Jennifer, the representative who'd helped me set up the account originally. These transactions appear to be external withdrawals, not bank-initiated fees. External withdrawals. Someone with access to my account information had been systematically draining small amounts of money over the past 4 months. The total was just over $3,400, not enough to destroy the business, but significant enough to impact our ability to hire additional customer support staff. I spent the next hour tracing the digital trail. Each withdrawal had been made using legitimate banking credentials, which meant someone had either hacked our account or had access to the login information. The timing was suspicious, too. The first withdrawal had occurred 3 days after my disastrous family dinner, right around the time Mother had started her research into my living situation. Then I remembered something that made my blood run cold. 6 months ago, when I'd first moved to Millbrook, I'd been having trouble with the business bank account setup. The requirements for business banking were complex, and I'd needed additional documentation to prove the company's legitimacy. In a moment of desperation, I'd called Dr. Blackthorne for help. He'd always been good with financial paperwork, and I thought he might have advice about business documentation requirements. During that conversation, I'd mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the banking requirements and had even read him some of the account details while asking for guidance on which forms to complete first. He'd been helpful, offering to review my paperwork if I wanted to send it over. I never did send the paperwork, but I had shared enough information during that call for someone with financial experience to potentially piece together my account details. Feeling paranoid but unable to shake my suspicions, I drove to the bank in person. Jennifer agreed to meet with me privately and help review the withdrawal patterns in more detail. "These are definitely sophisticated," she said, studying the transaction logs on her computer. "Whoever did this knew exactly how to stay under the radar for automatic fraud detection. Small amounts, irregular timing, legitimate-looking transaction codes. This wasn't random, it was planned." "Can you trace where the money went?" Jennifer clicked through several screens, then frowned. "That's interesting. The funds were transferred to an account at Westbridge Trust and Savings. That's the bank used by most of the wealthy families in Windermere Heights." My heart started racing. "Can you tell me the account holder?" "I can't give you specific account information, but I can tell you that the transfers were made to a business account registered under the name Hartwell Family Estate Management, LLC. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of Jennifer's desk to steady myself. "Are you okay, Miss Hartwell?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I had seen a ghost, the ghost of my own naivety. My family hadn't just been dismissing my business success, they'd been actively undermining it. "I need to see every transaction detail you can legally show me," I said, my voice barely steady. For the next hour, Jennifer and I pieced together a pattern that was both sophisticated and devastating. The withdrawals had started small, under $100, but had gradually increased as whoever was behind them tested the limits of what they could take without triggering alerts. The timing coincided perfectly with periods when I'd been most stressed about cash flow, forcing me to delay hiring decisions and equipment upgrades. But the most damning evidence came when Jennifer showed me the authorization codes. These withdrawals required secondary authorization, she explained. Someone would need access to both your account login and your secondary verification method. How do you receive verification codes for large transactions? Text messages to my phone, I said. Then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. But I gave my old phone to my sister when I bought a new one 6 months ago. I thought I'd transferred everything properly, but maybe. If someone still had access to your old verification method, they could potentially intercept authorization codes. I called Penelope immediately. Victoria? She sounded surprised to hear from me so soon after Sunday's family gathering. Is everything okay? Penelope, do you still have the phone I gave you? The iPhone 12? Oh, that old thing. I gave it to Mother for one of her charity auctions months ago. Why? When did you give it to her? I don't know, maybe 4 months ago? She said she could get a good price for it at the Spring Gala charity auction. Victoria, why are you asking about an old phone? 4 months ago, exactly when the withdrawals had started. I hung up and sat in my car outside the bank for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd discovered. My family hadn't just been unsupportive, they'd been stealing from me. Small amounts, carefully calculated to avoid detection, but stealing nonetheless. The cruelest part wasn't the money, it was the timing. They'd been taking funds during my most vulnerable period, when every dollar mattered for the business's survival. When I was eating ramen noodles and wearing the same 3 outfits because I was reinvesting every penny into ElderShield Digital.
And they'd done it while lecturing me about financial responsibility and life choices. I drove back to Millbrook in a fog of betrayal and rage. The investor call with Atlantic Ventures was in 30 minutes, and I needed to pull myself together. But how do you focus on business growth when you've just discovered your own family has been systematically sabotaging your success? My phone rang as I pulled into the alley behind my building. It was David Rahman. Miss Hartwell, I hope you don't mind that I'm calling a few minutes early. I've been reviewing your platform's metrics this morning, and I have to say, I'm impressed by your growth trajectory despite what appears to be some significant financial constraints. Despite significant financial constraints. If only he knew how significant and how deliberately imposed those constraints had been. I appreciate the call, Mr. Rahman, I managed to say. I'm excited to discuss ElderShield Digital's potential. Before we dive into the formal presentation, I have to ask, how have you managed such consistent user growth and retention rates while operating on what our research suggests is an extremely lean budget? Your customer acquisition costs are remarkably low, and your user satisfaction scores are off the charts. Frankly, it's the kind of efficiency that suggests either exceptional business acumen or external factors we're not seeing. External factors, that was one way to put it. We've been very strategic about resource allocation, I said, which was technically true. Every decision has been made with long-term sustainability in mind. Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. We'd like to discuss a Series A round that would give you the resources to scale rapidly. We're talking about $2.5 million in initial funding, with the potential for additional rounds based on performance milestones. $2.5 million? More money than my family had ever given me credit for even imagining, let alone earning. As David outlined Atlantic Ventures' interest in ElderShield Digital, I found myself thinking about Sunday's family dinner, about Mother's folder of receptionist jobs, about Dr. Blackthorn's suggestion that I needed professional help for my delusional thinking, about Penelope's offer to let me be a bridesmaid if I could get myself together. They'd been stealing from me while telling me I was a failure. They'd been undermining my success while offering to save me from my supposed delusions. They'd been actively sabotaging the very thing they claimed didn't exist. Mr. Rahman, I said, interrupting his explanation of the funding timeline, I need to ask you something. How long has Atlantic Ventures been tracking ElderShield Digital? We've been monitoring your growth for about 8 months now. You appeared on our radar when your user base hit the 10,000 mark, and we've been watching your metrics ever since. Why do you ask? 8 months. My family had known, or at least suspected, that my fantasy project was real and growing. They'd known, and they'd chosen to undermine it anyway. Miss Hartwell, are you still there? Yes, I'm here, I said, and for the first time in months, I felt completely present, clear, focused. Mr. Rahman, I'd like to schedule an in-person meeting as soon as possible. There are some developments in my business situation that I think will interest you very much. After I hung up, I sat in Mrs. Chen's kitchen and did something I hadn't done since leaving Thornfield Manor on Sunday. I smiled, because I'd just realized that my family's betrayal wasn't just evidence of their cruelty, it was evidence of their fear. They hadn't been stealing from a failure, they'd been stealing from a threat. The text message arrived at 11:43 p.m. on Wednesday, 3 days after my discovery of the theft and 2 days after my meeting with Atlantic Ventures. I was in my studio apartment reviewing the term sheet that David Rahman had sent over, $2.5 million in Series A funding with a company valuation that made my hands shake when I read it. The message was from Mother. Family meeting tomorrow, 7 p.m., Thornfield Manor. Your attendance is required. We need to discuss your future before this situation becomes irreversible. No greeting, no explanation. Just a command delivered like I was still a child who could be summoned at will. I stared at that text for a long time, thinking about how much had changed since Sunday's humiliation. Atlantic Ventures wasn't just interested in funding ElderShield Digital, they wanted to fast-track our expansion into 12 new markets. David had introduced me to 2 other portfolio companies that wanted to partner with our platform. We'd received inquiries from senior living facilities in 6 states asking about enterprise licensing. Everything my family had dismissed as fantasy was becoming reality at a pace that even I found breathtaking. But I also knew why they'd called this meeting. Dr. Blackthorne was smart enough to eventually notice the banking irregularities, especially if he'd been monitoring my account activity. They probably thought I'd discovered the theft and were planning some kind of damage control. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 3 days consulting with a forensic accountant and a business attorney. What they didn't know was that I had documentation of every fraudulent transaction, every authorization code intercepted through my old phone, every penny they'd stolen while lecturing me about financial responsibility. What they didn't know was that I was done being their victim. I drove to Thornfield Manor on Thursday evening with a leather portfolio containing bank statements, legal documents, and a printed copy of the Atlantic Ventures term sheet. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't nervous about facing my family. I was angry. Maria answered the door with a concerned expression. Miss Victoria, they're waiting in the study. I hope everything works out for you, dear. The study was Mother's favorite room for serious conversations. All dark wood and leather-bound books that no one actually read, designed to intimidate and establish hierarchy. The family was arranged exactly as I'd expected. Mother behind the massive oak desk like a judge, Dr. Blackthorne and Penelope in the leather chairs like a jury, grandmother in her wheelchair positioned slightly apart from the others. Victoria, Mother began without preamble, we've asked you here because this family has reached a breaking point. Your behavior over the past 2 years has become increasingly concerning, and we can no longer enable what appears to be a complete break from reality. She opened a folder on the desk. Apparently, prepared statements were a Hartwell family tradition. Dr. Blackthorne has consulted with colleagues about your situation, and the consensus is that you're experiencing what psychologists call grandiose delusions. Your insistence that you've built a successful business, your refusal to accept help finding appropriate employment, your isolation from family and appropriate social connections, these are all symptoms of someone who needs professional intervention. I set my portfolio on the side table and waited for her to continue. Let them say everything they'd planned to say. Let them dig their hole as deep as possible. We've researched the legal options for family-initiated mental health evaluations, Dr. Blackthorne added, his voice clinical and detached. In cases where an individual poses a danger to themselves through persistent delusional behavior, the state allows for temporary commitments for psychiatric evaluation. A psychiatric evaluation? They were threatening to have me committed. We don't want to take such drastic measures, Penelope said, her voice carefully modulated to sound caring. But Victoria, you have to understand how this looks from the outside. You're 29, living in poverty, claiming to run a company that no one can verify exists. When we try to help, you become defensive and hostile. When we offer you real opportunities, you dismiss them as beneath you. The pattern is clear, Mother continued, and it's escalating. Your grandmother told us about your bizarre claims during Sunday's visit, talking about investor meetings and funding rounds like they were real. Victoria, these fantasies are becoming more elaborate and detailed. That's not a good sign. Grandmother hadn't spoken yet, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. They'd gotten to her too, convinced her that my success was actually evidence of mental illness. So here's what's going to happen, Mother said, sliding a document across the desk. We've arranged for a voluntary psychiatric evaluation at Westbridge Mental Health Center. Dr. Patterson is the finest psychiatrist in the county, and he's agreed to see you tomorrow morning. After a proper evaluation and treatment plan, we can discuss your return to the family and appropriate career assistance. I picked up the document and read it carefully. It was a voluntary commitment form, already filled out with my personal information, requiring only my signature to begin a 72-hour psychiatric hold. And if I refuse, I asked? Dr. Blackthorne leaned forward. Victoria, we have documentation of your erratic behavior, your financial instability, your claims about imaginary business success. If necessary, we can petition the court for an involuntary evaluation, but we'd prefer to handle this quietly within the family. Documentation. They'd been building a case against me, collecting evidence of my supposed mental illness while actively undermining my actual success. We love you, Penelope added, and she actually sounded sincere. But we can't watch you destroy yourself anymore. This delusion that you're some kind of successful entrepreneur, it's preventing you from getting the help you need to build a real life. That was the moment I realized they weren't just stealing money or dismissing my work. They were trying to erase my reality entirely. They were so committed to their version of who I should be that they'd convinced themselves my actual achievements were symptoms of mental illness. You're absolutely right, I said, opening my portfolio. This situation has become irreversible. I pulled out the bank statements first, spreading them across Mother's pristine desk. These are transaction records showing $3,400 in unauthorized withdrawals from my business account over the past 4 months. The funds were transferred to an account registered under Hartwell Family Estate Management, LLC. Would anyone like to explain how that's possible? The room went silent. Dr. Blackthorne's face went pale. Mother stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. The withdrawals were authorized using verification codes sent to my old phone, the one Penelope gave to Mother for a charity auction. Except there's no record of that phone ever being sold at any auction. Someone has been using it to intercept my banking authorizations. I pulled out the forensic accountant's report next. This is a professional analysis of the theft pattern, sophisticated, calculated, designed to avoid detection while maximizing damage to my cash flow. Not the work of a random hacker, the work of someone with inside knowledge of my business operations and access to my personal information. Penelope started to say something, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. This is the Atlantic Ventures term sheet for $2.5 million in Series A funding for ElderShield Digital, the company you've been calling a delusion, the fantasy you think requires psychiatric treatment. It's valued at $12 million according to one of the most prestigious venture capital firms on the East Coast. I placed the term sheet directly in front of Mother, watching her eyes widen as she read the numbers.
And this, I said, pulling out the final document, is a legal opinion from Morrison & Associates confirming that the unauthorized access to my banking accounts constitutes felony fraud under state law. The estimated damages, including lost business opportunities due to cash flow disruption, exceed $50,000, which makes this a Class B felony with potential prison time. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear Mother's shallow breathing, could see Dr. Blackthorne's hands trembling slightly as he processed what I'd just revealed. So, I continued, my voice steady and calm, this situation has reached a breaking point, but not because I'm delusional, because you've been systematically stealing from and undermining a business that's about to make me a millionaire. Mother finally found her voice. Victoria, I don't understand. You don't understand that your failure of a daughter is about to be featured in Forbes magazine? You don't understand that the fantasy company you've been mocking has 43,000 active users across 18 states? You don't understand that while you were planning my psychiatric commitment, CNN was reaching out to interview me for their Rising Stars in Tech feature? I stood up, gathering my documents back into the portfolio. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to transfer back every penny you stole, plus interest and damages. You're going to publicly apologize for your fraud and theft, and you're going to stay completely out of my business and my life. Victoria, Dr. Blackthorne started. Or, I continued, I file criminal charges tomorrow morning, and we can discuss your psychiatric theories from opposite sides of a courtroom. I walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. Oh, and Mother, you might want to cancel that psychiatric evaluation appointment. I'll be busy tomorrow meeting with the CNN production team to discuss my upcoming interview as their youngest CEO of the year. I left them sitting in that study, surrounded by the evidence of their own criminal stupidity, and drove back to Millbrook with the windows down and music playing loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood. For the first time in my life, I was completely free from their judgment. And tomorrow, the whole world was going to know exactly who Victoria Hartwell really was. What my family never knew, what they couldn't have known because they'd written me off as delusional, was that while they were planning my psychiatric commitment, I'd been secretly working on something that would revolutionize elder care across the entire United States. The CNN interview request hadn't come out of nowhere. It had come because 3 months earlier, during the height of my family's intervention planning, ElderShield Digital had quietly prevented one of the largest cyber attacks on senior citizens in American history. It started with Mrs. Abernathy, my first client, the 73-year-old woman whose bank theft had inspired me to build the platform in the first place. She'd called our 24/7 support line on a Tuesday evening in March, confused about a series of emails claiming her Medicare benefits were being suspended. "Victoria, dear," she said when she recognized my voice, "I know these are probably scams, but they look so official. They have my Medicare number, my address, even my doctor's name. How could criminals know all that information?" I stayed on the phone with Mrs. Abernathy for 40 minutes, walking her through the emails step by step. What I discovered made my blood run cold. These weren't typical phishing scams. They were sophisticated, personalized attacks using data that should have been impossible for criminals to obtain. Over the next week, 17 more ElderShield Digital users reported similar emails. All contained accurate personal information. All demanded immediate action to verify Medicare accounts. All looked legitimate enough to fool even tech-savvy seniors. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with random cybercriminals. We were looking at a coordinated attack on the Medicare system itself. I spent the next 72 hours in my studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House, surviving on coffee and determination, tracing the digital fingerprints of the attack. What I found was terrifying. A criminal organization had infiltrated 3 different Medicare processing centers and stolen the personal data of over 2.3 million seniors across 12 states. The scam was brilliant in its simplicity. Criminals would send official-looking emails claiming Medicare benefits were being suspended due to verification issues. Panicked seniors would click links that installed malware on their computers, giving criminals access to bank accounts, investment portfolios, and Social Security information. The estimated potential losses were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. But here's what made ElderShield Digital different from every other cybersecurity company. We weren't just protecting data, we were protecting people. While traditional cybersecurity firms focused on corporate clients and enterprise solutions, I'd built our platform specifically to understand how seniors interact with technology. Our AI algorithms didn't just detect suspicious activity. They detected confusion, fear, and the specific behavioral patterns that elderly users were vulnerable to sophisticated scams. Mrs. Abernathy's call had triggered an automatic alert in our system. Within hours, we'd identified the threat and begun tracking its scope. Within days, we'd mapped the entire criminal network. And while my family was researching psychiatric facilities, I was working directly with the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez contacted me on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks before my family's final intervention attempt. She'd been investigating reports of Medicare fraud when ElderShield Digital's threat detection system had identified patterns that their own cybersecurity teams had missed.
Miss Hartwell, she said during our first phone call, your platform flagged this attack vector 6 days before it appeared on our radar. How is that possible? The answer was something I'd been trying to explain to my family for 2 years. ElderShield Digital wasn't just a simplified interface for seniors. It was an advanced cybersecurity platform specifically designed to protect the most vulnerable internet users in America. Every feature I'd built, the simplified banking interface, the medication reminders, the family communication tools, included sophisticated background monitoring that could detect when seniors were being targeted by criminals. Our AI analyzed typing patterns, click behaviors, email interactions, even the time of day users access their accounts, building comprehensive profiles that could spot anomalies before they became disasters. When Mrs. Abernathy received those Medicare scam emails, our system immediately recognized that she was interacting with content that didn't match her typical online behavior. When 17 other users reported similar emails, our algorithms connected the dots and identified a coordinated attack that federal agencies had missed entirely. "We need your help," Agent Martinez said. "Our cybersecurity teams are excellent at analyzing threats after they've been identified, but your platform seems to predict them before they happen. Would you be willing to work with us on this case?" For the next 6 weeks, while my family was documenting my erratic behavior and planning my psychiatric evaluation, I was operating as an unofficial consultant to the FBI's cybercrime division. Every night, after my family assumed I was languishing in my fantasy world, I was actually tracking criminal networks, analyzing attack patterns, and helping federal agents build cases against some of the most sophisticated cybercriminals in the world. The operation culminated on a Wednesday morning in April, exactly 1 week before my family's intervention meeting. Working with FBI field offices in 7 states, we executed simultaneous raids that resulted in 43 arrests and the seizure of over $127 million in stolen assets. But the real victory wasn't the arrests, it was the prevention. By identifying the attack early and working with law enforcement to shut it down, we'd protected 2.3 million seniors from having their life savings stolen by criminals who specifically targeted the elderly because they perceived them as easy marks. The case made national news, but the FBI couldn't publicly acknowledge ElderShield Digital's role without compromising ongoing investigations. So while news outlets reported on the largest Medicare fraud bust in FBI history, my contribution remained classified. That's why the CNN interview request had been so shocking when it arrived. It came not from their business desk, but from their investigative journalism team, which had been quietly researching the Medicare fraud case for months. They'd discovered that a small technology company had been instrumental in identifying and stopping the attack, and they wanted to tell the story of how one platform had revolutionized cybersecurity for seniors. Ms. Hartwell, the CNN producer, had said during our preliminary call, "We've been investigating this Medicare fraud case for 3 months. Every law enforcement source we've spoken to mentions ElderShield Digital as the key to solving this case. They're calling it the most significant cybersecurity innovation for vulnerable populations in decades." While Dr. Blackthorne was consulting colleagues about my grandiose delusions, CNN was fact-checking a story about how my imaginary company had prevented the largest theft from seniors in American history. While Mother was planning my psychiatric commitment, the FBI was preparing to recommend ElderShield Digital for a commendation from the Department of Justice. While Penelope was researching mental health facilities, Forbes was writing an article about how I'd built a $12 million company by focusing on a market that everyone else had ignored. The irony was perfect and devastating. My family had been so convinced of my failure that they'd missed my greatest success. But the real secret weapon, the thing that would make the CNN interview truly explosive, was that I'd documented everything. Every family dinner where they'd mocked my work, every conversation where they'd dismissed my users as irrelevant, every moment where they chose their social reputation over my actual achievements. I had recordings of Mother calling ElderShield Digital a pathetic hobby. I had emails from Dr. Blackthorne suggesting I needed professional help for my technology obsession. I had text messages from Penelope laughing about my fantasy business with her law school friends. And now, I had something else. FBI commendations, congressional recognition for cybersecurity innovation, and a CNN platform to tell the story of how I'd built something revolutionary while my own family was stealing from me and planning my psychiatric commitment. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning. On Sunday evening, I sat in my studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House,
reviewing my notes and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. Tomorrow, the whole world would learn about ElderShield Digital. They'd learn about the Medicare fraud case, the FBI collaboration, the revolutionary approach to cybersecurity for seniors. But they'd also learn about my family, about the theft, the sabotage, the psychiatric intervention attempts. They'd learn that while I was saving 2.3 million seniors from financial devastation, my own family was trying to have me committed for the crime of dreaming bigger than their expectations. The story would be devastating for the Hartwell reputation in Windermere Heights, but it would also be the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most revolutionary thing you can build. The morning of the CNN interview, I woke up at 5 a.m. to the sound of Mrs. Chen preparing noodles downstairs, just like I had every morning for the past 18 months. But this time, instead of rushing to check user support tickets or review financial projections, I was getting ready to tell the world about the extraordinary double life I'd been living while my family planned my psychiatric commitment. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning. On Sunday evening, I sat in my studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House, reviewing my notes and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. Tomorrow, the whole world would learn about ElderShield Digital. They'd learn about the Medicare fraud case, the FBI collaboration, the revolutionary approach to cybersecurity for seniors. But they'd also learn about my family, about the theft, the sabotage, the psychiatric intervention attempts. They'd learn that while I was saving 2.3 million seniors from financial devastation, my own family was trying to have me committed for the crime of dreaming bigger than their expectations. The story would be devastating for the Hartwell reputation in Windermere Heights, but it would also be the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most revolutionary thing you can build. The morning of the CNN interview, I woke up at 5 a.m. to the sound of Mrs. Chen preparing noodles downstairs, just like I had every morning for the past 18 months. But this time, instead of rushing to check user support tickets or review financial projections, I was getting ready to tell the world about the extraordinary double life I'd been living while my family planned my psychiatric commitment. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning. On Sunday evening, I sat in my studio apartment above Chen's Noodle House, reviewing my notes and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. Tomorrow, the whole world would learn about ElderShield Digital. They'd learn about the Medicare fraud case, the FBI collaboration, the revolutionary approach to cybersecurity for seniors. But they'd also learn about my family, about the theft, the sabotage, the psychiatric intervention attempts. They'd learn that while I was saving 2.3 million seniors from financial devastation, my own family was trying to have me committed for the crime of dreaming bigger than their expectations. The story would be devastating for the Hartwell reputation in Windermere High, but it would also be the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the most revolutionary thing you can build. The morning of the CNN interview, I woke up at 5 a.m. to the sound of Mrs. Chen preparing noodles downstairs, just like I had every morning for the past 18 months. But this time, instead of rushing to check user support tickets or review financial projections, I was getting ready to tell the world about the extraordinary double life I'd been living while my family planned my psychiatric commitment.
At 6 a.m., I was sitting in my tiny bathroom, applying makeup with drugstore cosmetics I'd bought with coupon discounts, the same routine I'd followed every day while secretly coordinating with federal agents. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was preparing for a national television interview about my cybersecurity innovations using a cracked mirror I'd been too cash-strapped to replace. By 7 a.m., the CNN production van was parked outside Chen's Noodle House, drawing curious stares from my neighbors in Millbrook. The producer, Sandra Kem, looked around the narrow alley with barely concealed surprise. "Ms. Hartwell, are you sure you want to film here? We could arrange for a studio interview, or perhaps use a more traditional business setting." "This is perfect," I said, gesturing toward the fire escape where Frank and I had shared so many conversations about dignity and innovation. This is where ElderShield Digital was really built, not in some corporate boardroom, but right here in the real world. What followed was the most surreal 3 hours of my life, a nationally televised interview that captured the full absurdity of how I'd been living for nearly 2 years. Sandra started with the standard questions about my background and education, but when she asked about my development environment, I found myself describing how I'd coded the FBI's most advanced senior cybersecurity protocols while sitting cross-legged on my studio apartment floor, debugging algorithms that would protect millions of seniors while eating instant ramen for the 3rd day in a row. Let me understand this correctly, Sandra said, reviewing her notes. You were living in a 342 square foot apartment above a restaurant, working 18-hour days on technology that the FBI now considers revolutionary, while your family believed you were unemployed and delusional? That's exactly right, I confirmed. Every morning, I'd wake up to my mother's text messages asking when I was going to get serious about finding real work. Every afternoon, I'd take calls from Special Agent Martinez discussing threat vectors and attack patterns that could affect millions of seniors. Every evening, I'd get lectures from my family about financial responsibility while I was actually preventing the largest theft from elderly Americans in history. The camera crew captured everything: my makeshift desk setup where I'd analyzed criminal networks, the corner where I'd taken FBI briefing calls while my family assumed I was playing computer games, the kitchen window where I'd watched sunrise after sunrise while building something my family couldn't even comprehend. But the most powerful moment came when Sandra asked me to walk through a typical day during the height of the Medicare fraud investigation. It was March 15th, I said, checking my journal entries on camera. I woke up at 5 a.m. to a call from Agent Martinez about new attack vectors they'd identified overnight. I spent the morning updating our threat detection algorithms to catch variations of the Medicare scam. At noon, I had lunch with my grandmother. She was asking about my computer hobby and suggesting I consider secretarial work because technology jobs aren't stable for women. I pulled out my phone and showed the CNN crew the actual text messages from that day. At 2 p.m., my sister Penelope texted me asking if I was still pretending to run a business and suggesting I join her for retail therapy to cheer me up. At 3 p.m., I was in a secure video conference with FBI field offices in 7 states, coordinating the final phases of an operation that would ultimately recover $127 million in stolen assets. Sandra shook her head. And your family had no idea? None. At 6 p.m. that same day, I attended a family dinner where my stepfather, Dr. Blackthorne, spent 20 minutes explaining to the other guests why my computer obsession was probably a symptom of depression and social anxiety. He suggested I might benefit from medication to help me reconnect with reality. I showed her my notes from that dinner, where I'd actually been mentally reviewing security protocols while nodding politely through lectures about my failed life choices. At 9 p.m., while my mother was telling her friends about her disappointing daughter who lives in poverty by choice, I was actually reviewing financial projections that showed ElderShield Digital was on track to prevent over $50 million in fraud just in the first quarter. At midnight, while they assumed I was probably crying myself to sleep over my life failures, I was celebrating with my FBI team because we'd identified the exact server locations being used to coordinate attacks on 2.3 million seniors. The production team captured the physical evidence of this double life: the FBI commendation letter that had arrived the same week my family researched psychiatric facilities, the Department of Justice recognition that came on the exact day Mother had scheduled my intervention meeting, the Congressional Cybersecurity Award that was dated 3 days before Dr. Blackthorne had filled out involuntary commitment paperwork. But Sandra's most devastating question came near the end of the interview. Victoria, you've shown us documentation proving that your family was actually stealing money from your business accounts while publicly questioning your mental health. Can you walk us through what that felt like? I took a deep breath, thinking about all those mornings when I'd checked my bank balance and wondered why our cash flow was so much tighter than our user growth suggested it should be. I showed her the bank statements, side by side with our user growth charts.
I was working 80-hour weeks, skipping meals, wearing the same clothes for months, all because I thought every dollar needed to go back into protecting our users. I was sleeping on an air mattress because I thought I couldn't afford a real bed while building something worth $12 million. And the whole time, my family was systematically draining money from the accounts while lecturing me about financial responsibility. What's perhaps most remarkable, Sandra noted, is that despite this sabotage, despite the family pressure and the financial constraints they imposed, you still built something extraordinary. The seniors didn't care that my family thought I was delusional, I said. Mrs. Abernathy didn't care that I was living above a noodle house when I helped her recover her stolen savings. The FBI didn't care about my apartment size when they needed someone who could predict cyber attacks before they happened.
The only people who couldn't see the value of what I was building were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The interview concluded with Sandra asking about my family's reaction to learning about the CNN feature. I pulled out my phone and showed her the text message that had arrived that morning from Mother. I don't know what lies you've told those reporters, but this publicity stunt won't change the fact that you need professional help. Don't embarrass the family further. They still don't believe it's real, I said. Even with FBI documentation, congressional recognition, and a $12 million company valuation, they're convinced this is all an elaborate fantasy I've constructed to avoid admitting failure. Sandra looked directly into the camera for her closing statement. What we've discovered in our investigation is a story that challenges everything we think we know about success, family, and the price of innovation. Victoria Hartwell built a revolutionary cybersecurity platform that has protected millions of seniors while living in a studio apartment above a restaurant, surviving on instant noodles, and enduring systematic sabotage from the people closest to her. She paused, letting the full weight of the story settle. But perhaps most remarkably, she did it all while maintaining her integrity, her commitment to her users, and her belief that technology should serve the most vulnerable members of our society. This isn't just a story about business success, it's a story about moral courage in the face of betrayal. As the CNN crew packed up their equipment, I sat on my fire escape and looked out over Millbrook, the neighborhood my family had seen as evidence of my failure, but which had actually been the launching pad for something extraordinary. Tomorrow, that interview would air on national television. Tomorrow, the world would learn the truth about ElderShield Digital, about the Medicare fraud case, about my family's theft and psychiatric intervention attempts. Tomorrow, everyone would see the contrast between what my family believed about my life and what I'd actually accomplished while they weren't looking. But tonight, I was just Victoria Hartwell, sitting above Chen's Noodle House, finally ready to let the world see who I really was. The CNN interview aired on Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I watched it alone in my studio apartment, sitting on the same air mattress where I'd spent countless nights coding the algorithms that had saved millions of seniors from financial devastation. But for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't watching as someone who needed approval or validation from my family. I was watching as someone who had finally learned the difference between being loved and being controlled. The realization had come gradually over the past week, building toward a moment of clarity that would fundamentally change how I saw myself and my relationship with the people who had raised me. It started with a conversation I'd had with Mrs. Chen the morning after my confrontation at Thornfield Manor. "Victoria," she'd said, as I grabbed my usual coffee before the Atlantic Ventures meeting, "I saw your family drive through the neighborhood last week. They took pictures of the building, asked my neighbor questions about you. Why would family members spy on you like strangers?" That question had stopped me cold. Why would they spy, instead of simply asking? Why would they gather evidence against me, instead of evidence for me? Why would they research psychiatric facilities, instead of researching what I was actually building? The answer was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Because they'd never been interested in who I really was, they'd been interested in who they needed me to be to validate their own choices and social standing. Mrs. Chen had continued, her voice gentle but firm. "In my culture, family supports family even when they don't understand. When my son wanted to study art instead of business, his father was angry, but we didn't try to have him declared mentally ill. We tried to learn about art." That conversation had planted a seed that grew throughout the week. Every interaction with my family took on a different meaning when I stopped viewing their behavior through the lens of love and started viewing it through the lens of control. The psychiatric evaluation threat wasn't concern. It was a power play designed to force me back into their version of acceptable behavior. The theft wasn't desperation. It was sabotage designed to make my fantasy collapse under financial pressure. The public humiliation wasn't disappointment, it was punishment for daring to succeed outside their approved parameters. But the turning point, the moment I truly understood what I'd been enabling for years, came during a phone call with Agent Martinez 2 days before the CNN interview aired.
"Victoria," she'd said, "I have to ask you something personal. During our investigation, we noticed that the theft from your accounts coincided exactly with periods when you were making the most progress on the Medicare fraud case.
It's almost like someone was monitoring your work and trying to undermine it at the most critical moments. Did anyone in your personal life have access to information about your FBI collaboration? I'd sat in stunned silence, thinking about family dinners where I'd mentioned being busy with important work, conversations where I'd hinted at big developments in the business, moments when I'd been excited about progress and shared just enough detail for someone to piece together timing patterns. Agent Martinez, I'd said slowly, I think my family might have been deliberately sabotaging my work because they knew it was succeeding. The words had hung in the air like a confession I'd been afraid to make to myself. That would explain the sophistication of the timing, she'd replied. Someone with inside knowledge of your emotional state and business cycles could have calculated exactly when financial pressure would be most damaging to your work. After that conversation, I'd spent hours reviewing every family interaction over the past 2 years, looking for patterns I'd been too hopeful or too naive to see clearly. The timing of Mother's most vicious public humiliations always coincided with my biggest breakthroughs. The psychiatric evaluation threats escalated precisely when ElderShield Digital was gaining the most recognition. The theft amounts increased during weeks when I'd mentioned positive developments or upcoming opportunities. They hadn't been trying to save me from delusion. They'd been trying to stop my success because it threatened their narrative about who I was supposed to be. That realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that the people I'd spent my entire life trying to please had been actively working against my happiness and success. Liberating because it meant I could finally stop trying to earn approval from people who were fundamentally invested in my failure. The phone started ringing at 8:47 p.m., exactly 13 minutes after the CNN interview ended. I let every call go to voicemail, but I could see the caller IDs. Mother, Dr. Blackthorne, Penelope, even distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years. By 10 p.m., I had 37 missed calls and 16 voicemails. But I didn't listen to them, not that night. Instead, I called Frank, my homeless veteran friend who'd become an unofficial advisor. He was staying at the downtown shelter, but they let residents take calls until 11 p.m. Frank, I said when he answered, did you watch the CNN interview? Miss Victoria, half the shelter watched it. You've got people here calling you a hero. Mrs. Patterson from the front desk says her grandson saw it too, and he's studying computer programming because of your story. How do you think my family took it? Frank was quiet for a long moment. Victoria, I've been homeless for 3 years. You know what I learned about family? The people who love you want to see you succeed, even if they don't understand how you're doing it. The people who need to control you want to see you fail, especially if you're succeeding without their permission. His words hit me with the force of absolute truth. Your real family, Frank continued, is Mrs. Chen, who feeds you when you're too busy to eat. It's Mrs. Abernathy, who calls to check on you when she hasn't heard from you in a few days. It's all those seniors who trust you with their safety because they can feel that you genuinely care about them. The people upstairs at that fancy house, they're not your family. They're just people who happen to share your DNA. After I hung up with Frank, I finally listened to the voicemails. Mother's was predictably furious. Victoria, I don't know what lies you told those reporters, but you've humiliated this entire family on national television. You will retract every false statement you made, or I will personally ensure that everyone in this community knows the truth about your mental state. Dr. Blackthorne's was clinical and condescending. Victoria, this public display of grandiosity confirms our assessment about your psychological condition. We'll be consulting with legal counsel about involuntary commitment proceedings. But Penelope's was different. Her voice was shaky, uncertain. Victoria, I don't understand what happened. You really have FBI commendations? You really built something worth millions of dollars? I watched the interview 3 times, and I keep thinking there must be some mistake. How could we have been so wrong about everything? Call me back, please. I saved that voicemail and deleted the others. The next morning brought a flood of new developments that confirmed what I'd already realized. My success was never going to change my family's fundamental need to control my narrative.
At 7 a.m., I received an email from a reporter at the Windermere Heights Gazette, our local newspaper, asking for comment on a statement the Hartwell family had released, questioning my mental stability and claiming the CNN interview contained fabricated claims designed to gain sympathy and attention. They were publicly calling me delusional, even after national television had broadcast FBI documentation of my achievements. At 9 a.m., my attorney called to inform me that Dr. Blackthorne had contacted the court about expediting involuntary psychiatric evaluation proceedings, claiming the CNN interview proved I was a danger to myself and others due to persistent grandiose delusions. They were trying to have me committed for the crime of telling the truth on national television. At 11 a.m., Mrs. Abernathy called with news that made everything crystal clear.
Victoria, dear, she said, I got the strangest phone call this morning. A woman claiming to be your mother called to ask about my experiences with your company. She wanted to know if I was a real person or if you'd paid me to lie about being helped by your platform. My mother was calling my clients to gather evidence that my success was fabricated. That was the moment I truly understood what I'd been enabling for years. I'd been so desperate for their approval that I'd accepted systematic abuse, theft, and sabotage as normal family behavior. I'd been so committed to proving my worth to people who were fundamentally invested in my worthlessness that I'd nearly destroyed myself trying to meet impossible standards. But I was done being their victim. I was done trying to earn love from people who confused love with control. At noon, I called my attorney and authorized him to file criminal charges for the theft. At 1 p.m., I called Agent Martinez and asked her to investigate whether my family's sabotage had constituted obstruction of a federal investigation. At 2 p.m., I called the Windermere Heights Gazette and scheduled an interview to discuss my family's ongoing harassment and their attempts to have me committed for achieving success. For 29 years, I'd believed that being a good daughter meant accepting whatever treatment my family chose to give me, but I'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being controlled. And I was done being controlled by anyone. The deeper truth started unraveling on Thursday morning, 3 days after the CNN interview aired and 1 day after I'd authorized criminal charges against my family. I was reviewing financial documents with my attorney when he asked a question that would expose a conspiracy far more sinister than simple theft. Victoria, said James Morrison from Morrison & Associates, studying the bank records spread across his conference table, these withdrawal patterns are too sophisticated for opportunistic fraud. This level of coordination suggests advanced planning. Have you considered that your family might have had professional help designing this sabotage? The question hit me like ice water. Professional help? I'd been so focused on the emotional betrayal that I hadn't considered the technical expertise required to execute such a precise financial attack. What kind of professional help? I asked. The timing algorithms, the amount calculations designed to avoid detection, the way they exploited your verification systems, this looks like the work of someone with forensic accounting experience and cybersecurity knowledge, someone who understood both your business model and your personal vulnerabilities. That evening, I drove to Frank's shelter with a laptop and a portable Wi-Fi hotspot. Frank had become my most trusted advisor, and his insights into human behavior had been invaluable. But tonight, I needed his help with something more concrete. Frank, I said, setting up my computer in the shelter's common room, you mentioned you used to be a software engineer before you became homeless. I need you to look at something. For the next 2 hours, Frank and I analyzed the digital forensics of my family's theft. What we discovered was terrifying in its sophistication. Victoria, Frank said, pointing to patterns in the transaction logs, whoever did this didn't just steal money, they conducted a systematic study of your business operations. Look at these timestamps. They correspond exactly to periods when you were scaling customer support, developing new features, or expanding into new markets. He pulled up a timeline we'd created. Every major business milestone was followed within days by financial drainage designed to prevent you from capitalizing on your progress.
This wasn't random theft. This was strategic corporate sabotage. But the real revelation came when Frank started examining the technical metadata of the transactions. These authorization codes weren't just intercepted from your old phone, he said, his voice growing more concerned. Someone was actively monitoring your business communications. Look at this. Withdrawals consistently occurred within hours of you discussing cash flow needs with your developers or mentioning specific financial targets to your team. The implications were staggering. Someone had been monitoring not just my bank account, but my business communications. Someone had been tracking my success and systematically undermining it with surgical precision. Frank, how would someone get access to monitor business communications? He looked at me with the kind of expression reserved for delivering devastating news. Victoria, this level of access would require either sophisticated hacking capabilities or inside knowledge from someone who had legitimate access to your systems, someone you trusted with sensitive information. That's when I remembered the conversation that changed everything. 8 months earlier, when ElderShield Digital was struggling with server costs and I was desperate for advice, I'd reached out to the one person in my family who had both technical knowledge and business experience, Dr. Blackthorne. He'd built the entire IT infrastructure for his medical practice network. He understood HIPAA compliance, cybersecurity requirements, and financial systems management. When I'd called him for guidance, he'd seemed genuinely interested in helping. "Send me your system architecture diagrams," he said. "I can review your security protocols and maybe suggest some improvements. Medical practices deal with similar vulnerabilities." I'd been so grateful for what seemed like family support that I'd shared everything: server configurations, security protocols, financial management systems, even employee access credentials for our development team. "Frank," I said, feeling sick to my stomach, "I think I gave my stepfather complete access to my business systems 8 months ago." We spent the next hour reconstructing the timeline. Dr. Blackthorne's security review had occurred in September. The systematic theft had begun in October. The timing wasn't coincidental. But the evidence that confirmed our suspicions came from an unexpected source: my own security logs.
Every business system maintains access logs that record when and how users interact with sensitive data. I'd never thought to review these logs because I'd trusted the people who had access. But when Frank and I pulled up the administrative access records, we found something that made my hands shake. For the past 8 months, someone using Dr. Blackthorne's credentials had been logging into our financial management system every few days, not just viewing information, actively monitoring cash flow patterns, analyzing transaction volumes, tracking our growth metrics in real time. "Victoria," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper, "your stepfather has been conducting industrial espionage on your company for 8 months. He's been studying your business more carefully than you have." The access logs told a story of systematic surveillance and sabotage that was breathtaking in its scope. Dr. Blackthorne had been monitoring every aspect of ElderShield Digital's operations: customer acquisition rates, revenue projections, development timelines, even my personal communications with team members. "Frank," I said, staring at the screen, "your stepfather has been conducting industrial espionage on your company for 8 months. He's been studying your business more carefully than you have." The access logs told a story of systematic surveillance and sabotage that was breathtaking in its scope. Dr. Blackthorne had been monitoring every aspect of ElderShield Digital's operations: customer acquisition rates, revenue projections, development timelines, even my personal communications with team members. But the most damning evidence came from the correlation between his access patterns and the theft timing. Every major withdrawal from our accounts had been preceded by Dr. Blackthorne logging into our systems to review current cash flow and upcoming expenses. He hadn't been stealing random amounts. He'd been calculating exactly how much to take to cause maximum damage without killing the business entirely. He'd been surgical in his sabotage, designed to keep ElderShield Digital struggling but operational, probably to maintain the illusion that I was barely surviving while building something worthless. The final piece of evidence came from our communication logs.
Dr. Blackthorn's access credentials had been used to monitor my email communications with the FBI, my conversations with Atlantic Ventures, even my correspondence with CNN producers. Frank, I said, staring at the screen, he knew about everything. The FBI case, the funding offers, the CNN interview. He knew I was succeeding, and he was actively working to prevent it. That explains the psychiatric evaluation timing, Frank replied. He wasn't trying to help you. He was trying to stop you before your success became too obvious to hide. But the deepest betrayal came when we discovered what Dr. Blackthorn had been doing with the intelligence he'd gathered from monitoring my business. Hidden in our server logs was evidence that he'd been downloading our proprietary algorithms, our user data security protocols, and our fraud detection methodologies, not for personal use, for professional consultation. Victoria, Frank said, pulling up a series of files, it looks like your stepfather has been selling your cybersecurity innovations to other medical practices as his own intellectual property. He's been marketing Blackthorn cybersecurity solutions using technology you developed. The evidence was overwhelming. Dr. Blackthorn had been running a parallel consulting business using ElderShield Digital's innovations, marketing our fraud detection systems to medical practices as his own development work. He'd been profiting from the very technology he'd been publicly dismissing as worthless fantasy. For 8 months, while my family had been calling me delusional and planning my psychiatric commitment, Dr. Blackthorn had been stealing not just my money, but my intellectual property, building his own reputation as a cybersecurity expert using innovations I'd developed while living on ramen noodles above a restaurant. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just family dysfunction or financial opportunism. This was organized criminal conspiracy designed to steal my life's work while destroying my credibility and mental health. Frank, I said, printing out the evidence, I need to call Agent Martinez. This isn't just theft anymore. This is federal cybercrime. As I gathered the documentation that would ultimately lead to multiple felony charges against Dr. Blackthorn, I realized something that changed how I understood everything that had happened over the past 2 years. My family's treatment of me hadn't been born from disappointment or concern. It had been born from calculated malice designed to cover up systematic theft of intellectual property worth millions of dollars. They hadn't been trying to save me from delusion. They'd been trying to drive me to actual mental breakdown to prevent me from discovering their crimes. The psychiatric evaluation threats, the public humiliation, the financial sabotage, it had all been designed to make me question my own reality so thoroughly that I'd never investigate the discrepancies in my business finances. They'd been gaslighting me into believing I was failing while actively stealing the innovations that proved I was succeeding. But their plan had one fatal flaw. They'd underestimated my determination to protect the seniors who depended on ElderShield Digital. They'd assumed I'd eventually break under pressure and abandon my work. They'd been wrong about everything, including my willingness to fight back. Tomorrow, I would hand over evidence of their crimes to federal investigators. Tomorrow, the people who'd tried to have me committed for success would face criminal charges for systematic theft and intellectual property fraud. But tonight, I finally understood the full scope of what I'd been fighting against and what I'd managed to overcome despite impossible odds. 6 months later, I was standing in the ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel in downtown Westbridge City, wearing a custom-designed gown that cost more than my entire first year's rent above Chen's Noodle House. The CNN Business Leadership Awards ceremony was being broadcast live to millions of viewers, and I was about to accept the award for Youngest CEO of the Year in the technology sector. But the real victory wasn't the Crystal Trophy or the national recognition. The real victory was sitting in the front row of that ballroom. Mrs. Abernathy, Mrs. Chen, Frank, who was now employed as ElderShield Digital's senior security consultant, and 43 other seniors whose lives had been saved by the platform my family had tried to destroy. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of justice served and dreams realized in ways I'd never imagined possible.
3 weeks after I'd handed the evidence to Agent Martinez, federal prosecutors had filed 17 separate charges against Dr. Blackthorn, ranging from cybercrime and intellectual property theft to obstruction of a federal investigation.
The Blackthorn Cybersecurity Solutions consulting business had been shut down, and his medical licenses were under review by the state board. Mother and Penelope faced their own legal consequences. Mother was charged with conspiracy and money laundering for her role in channeling stolen funds through Hartwell Family Estate Management LLC. Penelope faced charges for identity theft and fraud related to the phone verification scam that had enabled the systematic theft. But the most satisfying justice had come from an unexpected source: the Windermere Heights community that had once been the source of my family's social power. When the full scope of the criminal conspiracy became public, when neighbors learned that the prestigious Dr. Blackthorn had been stealing cybersecurity innovations from his own daughter while publicly questioning her mental health, the social consequences were swift and devastating. The Windermere Heights Country Club revoked the family's membership. The charity organizations where Mother had been a board member asked for her resignation. The Ashford family quietly canceled Penelope's engagement, unwilling to associate their name with a family under federal criminal investigation. Everything my family had valued, social status, community respect, financial reputation, disappeared overnight when their crimes became public knowledge. But the most profound vindication had come from the success of ElderShield Digital itself. With the Series A funding from Atlantic Ventures, we'd expanded to operate in all 50 states. Our user base had grown to over 847,000 seniors, and our fraud prevention systems had stopped more than $342 million in attempted scams. The Department of Justice had officially adopted our threat detection algorithms for nationwide cybersecurity protection of Medicare systems. Forbes had featured me on their cover with the headline, "The 30-year-old who revolutionized eldercare cybersecurity." Harvard Business School had added ElderShield Digital as a case study in their entrepreneurship curriculum. 3 universities had offered me honorary doctorates for my contributions to cybersecurity innovation. But the recognition that meant the most had come from a handwritten letter I'd received 4 months earlier. Dear Victoria, my name is Margaret Foster, and I'm 79 years old. Last week, your ElderShield Digital platform prevented someone from stealing my entire life savings through one of those Medicare scams. Your system caught the attack and called me personally to explain what was happening. The young man who helped me said that your company exists specifically to protect people like me who feel lost in this digital world. I wanted you to know that you didn't just save my money, you saved my faith that there are still good people who care about protecting others. Thank you for building something that treats seniors with dignity and respect. The world needs more people like you. That letter was framed on my office wall, not the corner office in some gleaming corporate tower, but the renovated warehouse space in downtown Millbrook where ElderShield Digital had built its headquarters. We'd stayed in the neighborhood that had supported me during my darkest moments, and we'd brought 247 high-paying technology jobs to a community that had never seen that kind of economic opportunity. Mrs. Chen's restaurant had become our unofficial company cafeteria. Frank had his own apartment 2 blocks away and had been promoted to head our new initiatives in cybersecurity for homeless veterans. The studio apartment above the Noodle House had been converted into a museum of sorts, a reminder of where innovation could emerge when someone cared more about solving problems than seeking approval. But tonight, standing at the podium of the CNN Business Leadership Awards, I wasn't thinking about the past. I was thinking about the future and the speech I was about to give that would reach millions of viewers around the world. 6 years ago, I began, my voice steady and clear. I was told that I was an embarrassment to my family. I was living in a studio apartment above a restaurant, surviving on instant noodles, building something that everyone I loved told me was worthless fantasy. The ballroom was completely silent. 400 of the most successful business leaders in America hanging on every word. Tonight, I stand before you as the CEO of a company worth $127 million, having prevented over $400 million in fraud against our most vulnerable citizens, having worked directly with federal law enforcement to dismantle criminal networks that specifically target seniors. I paused, looking out at the audience where Mrs. Abernathy was wiping tears from her eyes. But I'm not here to tell you a story about business success. I'm here to tell you a story about moral courage, about the difference between being loved and being controlled, and about what happens when you choose to serve others even when the people closest to you can't see the value of what you're building. For the next 12 minutes, I told the entire story: the family betrayal, the systematic theft, the psychiatric evaluation threats, the criminal conspiracy that had nearly destroyed everything I'd worked to build. But I also told the story of Mrs. Abernathy, of Mrs. Chen, of Frank, of all the people who had supported me when my own family had abandoned me. The most important lesson I've learned, I concluded, is that your real family isn't determined by DNA or marriage certificates. Your real family consists of the people who want to see you succeed, who support your dreams even when they don't understand them, who celebrate your victories and help you recover from your failures. I gestured toward the front row where my chosen family was sitting. Elder Shield Digital exists today because I learned to stop seeking approval from people who were fundamentally invested in my failure and started listening to people who believed in my potential even when I couldn't see it myself. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 3 minutes, but what mattered most to me were the faces in that front row, people who had seen my worth when I was at my lowest point and had never wavered in their support. After the ceremony, as we celebrated at an after-party that cost more per person than I used to spend on groceries in a month, Mrs. Abernathy pulled me aside. "Victoria, dear," she said, "I have something to tell you. Your grandmother Vivian called me last week." My heart skipped. Grandmother had been the only family member who hadn't faced criminal charges, and I hadn't spoken to her since the day I'd walked out of Thornfield Manor. "She wanted me to give you a message," Mrs. Abernathy continued. "She said to tell you that she's proud of who you've become, that she always believed in you, and that she hopes someday you'll forgive an old woman for not having the courage to stand up to the others when it mattered." I stood in that ballroom, surrounded by the most successful people in America, holding a crystal award that represented everything I dreamed of achieving, and realized that forgiveness, like success, wasn't about other people's approval. It was about choosing to move forward with integrity, compassion, and a commitment to building something bigger than your own pain. Tomorrow, Elder Shield Digital would announce our next major initiative, a scholarship program for first-generation college students studying cybersecurity, funded entirely by our profits from protecting seniors. We'd also be opening our second headquarters in an economically disadvantaged area of Detroit, bringing technology jobs to another community that had been overlooked by traditional businesses. But tonight, I was just Victoria Hartwell, surrounded by people who had loved me when loving me was difficult, celebrating not just my success, but the transformation of pain into purpose. The girl who had once been called an embarrassment to her family had become someone whose life's work was protecting the most vulnerable members of society. The woman who had been threatened with psychiatric commitment for dreaming too big had built something that would outlast any trophy or recognition. And that, I realized as Mrs. Chen handed me a fortune cookie with a smile, was the most revolutionary thing I'd ever accomplished, turning their rejection into my redemption, their betrayal into my breakthrough, their attempt to destroy me into my determination to build something beautiful for others. The fortune inside the cookie made me laugh out loud. Your family is whoever helps you become who you're meant to be. Some truths, I thought, are worth waiting your whole life to discover. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.